Welcome back to Edwin Eisendrath's It's the Democracy, Stupid on WCPT 820.
All right, everybody. It's my treat to be joined by Josh Orton, who's the president of Demand Justice, an organization fighting to protect the rule of law and to reform our courts. That is today, I want to say a losing battle, but one that we really, really need. So welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for being here.
Hey, I don't think my listeners need to be convinced that the Supreme Court has been captured by right-wing interests in America. Yet this week, John Roberts went on a tear whining that although he has destroyed the Voting Rights Act, given Trump legal immunity, validated Trump's election conspiracies by even taking this case on mail-in ballots, he objects to being called the partisan actor that he is. Now, I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I saw that too. And what is so striking to me is how really condescending it was to the American people. The American people are not naive. The reason they think that the Supreme Court has been politicized and captured is because they're aware of what the Supreme Court has done and how they've conducted themselves. It just is facially untrue to say that the Supreme Court has not been acting politically. Just recently, you saw Clarence Thomas give an absolute screed against progressivism. Mm-hmm. Now, when you have, a progressive caucus in Congress, I call myself, progressivism is an ideology. It is a longstanding ideology in the United States. It is a political ideology. What in the world is a Supreme Court justice doing out giving a speech, railing against progressivism? If John Roberts doesn't want the court to be seen as political, then the justices in the majority on the Supreme Court have to stop acting like politicians. They have to stop ruling for Trump and the expansion of power for Trump and the Republican Party most of the time. They have to start, actually upholding the individual rights of people, and they have to stop, essentially achieving the wish list of giant corporations and the religious far right that they've had for generations, decision after decision after decision. And by the way, if they want to increase if they want to do something about the lack of trust in the Supreme Court, they should stop using the shadow docket, which is essentially what they've been doing to make rulings without any argument, without any justification, and without being signed. It is being abused. They will just say, we rule this way. We're not going to say who wrote it. We're not going to say what is behind it. This is the shadow docket, as it's called, was supposed to be used for procedural reasons. If John Roberts wants to stop being seen as a politician, if he wants the court to stop, being seen politically, and for the American people he wants to regain the trust of the American people, they have to start doing things vastly differently.
Yeah, I'm not an attorney. I read Supreme Court cases. I have since I've been an adult. I find them fascinating, and the dissents I think are largely written for Americans rather than, for the lawyers. It's just interesting. But the one thing I do understand, John Roberts can say, oh, you don't really understand constitutional law. This is a cult. That's why we wear robes. It's secret, right? It's oracle. But I understand political timing.
That's right.
And this court is playing politics with how long they sit on cases, what they take up when. There is not any reason to understand that, to protect that behind the secrecy of whatever constitutional law genius is. This is plain politics in its rawest form.
Well, I think, Edwin, you're onto something about this sort of the robes and everything. I think the other big problem that John Roberts has is he has an elitism problem. What they've done is essentially the reason that he tries to maintain this mythology that they're not political actors is by hiding behind what is essentially an elitist club of Supreme Court legal scholars and, behind Supreme Court jurisprudence, which I think I don't know. I don't mean to shock anybody when I say is kind of made up, right? A lot of what the right has done so successfully is they've created institutions like the Federal Society, where they've found lawyers who are intellectually very smart and have a very high talent for the specific legal craft, but who are also essentially political mercenaries. And so the job of a far-right conservative federal judge for the last 30, 40 years or so has been someone who can, thinking about what they want as a political outcome, essentially backfill it philosophically and legally with Supreme Court jurisprudence to essentially mask the political intention. That is the job of a right-wing judge these days. And honestly, the thing that I think is so absurd about John Roberts' statements is that people see through it. People understand. His problem is that people don't understand. His problem is that people do.
Yeah, I was going to get where you are in another 20 minutes, but I'll go there I'll go there right now.
Let's cut to the chase, Edwin.
We'll do this in a different way. The most important job. Well, let me ask this question first. If you had magic wand and they said, Josh, you can replace every judge in the federal judiciary today with a judge of your choice, you wouldn't pick left-leaning Alitos or Thomases for a single job, would you? Right. That's not what you're looking for, right? And this, when you go about being a judge in the way you described, a way that says, I have an outcome in mind and I am going to work the law to get it, you end up breaking the law. I mean, and I don't mean breaking a law, I mean breaking the law. You end up, I think the most important job of the Supreme Court is to make sure Americans know what the law is. Mm-hmm. Because, right, this function is complicated in America. It's enormously complicated, how the rule of law impacts society. And a court that acts the way these guys do leaves you not knowing. And so they've used the shadow docket in this way. And you have federal judges saying, I don't understand, I don't know how to do my job. All of the precedent says go this way. And you've issued a ruling with no explanation that says go the other way. What am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to do my job? Right? And it isn't just the shadow docket. The decision, Josh, on tariffs, mm-hmm. right, could have been a really easy decision. No, the executive branch doesn't have the power to tax. Mm-hmm. Instead, it was a lengthy, complicated set of decisions where they argued amongst themselves about what the law is. What is this major questions doctrine that we just made up?
That's right.
And they can't figure it out. So right. we're left in a nation that's supposed to be governed by the rule of law, where the Supreme Court, their most important job is to focus on the jurisprudence so we know what it is. And instead, they said, my job is the one you just described, right. which is my job is to bend jurisprudence to an outcome. And now we're left with a broken set of law.
Well, and I think that's a good point. And I would also, but I would challenge a little bit of what you said at the beginning, which is I would not choose a left-leaning Alito. However, I'm at the place where I'm not totally convinced that we have a system, that we have a Supreme Court, that we have a political system in which we have money flooding into our politics, and so Republican senators are forced to say that they will only confirm the most right-wing judges, right? Like a lot of how the Supreme Court got to where it is a product of how broken other parts of our democracy are. I'm not sure that there's. I don't know. I'll put it this way. I'm not sure how to return to a place, or even get to a place if it ever existed, where we have a Supreme Court where both parties agree to nominate people who are, in theory, just calling balls and strikes. Because I think this is part of the tension here, is that because the Constitution was written so many years ago, and because there's no way it could possibly, cover all of the different expansions of technology or social progress or the other thing, there's going to be interpretation. And so on some level, this idea that it is knowable what the Constitution says in some ways is a little bit of a myth itself, right? The idea of originalism. And so I think that what you're going to get is, you're always going to have judges or justices who come from different ideologies. And I think one of the criticisms of our own side might be, we have not yet recognized that this is not a meritocracy, that this is not just sort of some scientific or philosophical ivory tower, and we can just find the most skilled lawyers and put them there. this is a place where we actually need to nominate people who believe in what we believe in. And if I'm to sort of point to the apex of when I think this became a problem for us, it's sort of this weird historical event where, if you remember, Antonin Scalia died in the middle of a term, and Mitch McConnell almost immediately, as infamously, said, "Well, we're not going to confirm anybody before the midterm election. We want to see the results of what the people think," which is a ridiculous historical political maneuver. And so you had this
vacancy when Amy Coney Barrett was up.
Yeah. Correct. And so, but there was this opportunity where, President Obama was going to nominate someone that essentially he knew would never be confirmed. And so it was this opportunity to essentially nominate someone for messaging purposes, right? It was like the first ever historical messaging nomination, right? This person was a lame duck from the beginning. And so the question became, what message do you want to send by who you nominate? It wasn't even a question of who do you want on the court, because we knew who he was going to nominate wasn't going to be on the court. The question was, who do you want to say should be on the court? Okay.
So this is really, I know where you're going. This is really interesting. So he nominated Merrick Garland.
And so so the question was, so did he nominate someone like Sonia Sotomayor or someone like Ketanji Jackson Brown, who would be, who clearly would send a message to the Democratic base or the progressives that we want someone who will uphold, our version, what we believe the Constitution to be, and that will be a progressive stalwart and a champion who might replace Ruth Bader Ginsburg. No, he nominated someone to sort of try to project to the, Washington establishment that he was reasonable and the Republicans were unreasonable for blocking them. And let me tell you something, that message landed on no one. And so I think that while I agree that, it is in the ideal we should have people who just call balls and strikes, I'm not really sure that in our we're going to need people who, it's always going to be that the people that each party nominates are going to have an ideology. I think the question is, are they going to be intellectually honest about that ideology and about their views? And I think what the problem that this goes back to Roberts, I think the thing that really has created this problem for Roberts is that the right wing has for a very long time nominated people with an ideology and then lied through their teeth with a straight face that they don't have one, that they're just calling balls and strikes. I think it would be much better, frankly, if we were just more transparent about the fact that, we're going to nominate someone who believes in a progressive or believes in a conservative ideology. Like, if you want to nominate someone who is going to rule with corporations 99% of the time, just say that and see how we do.
Yeah, well,
it's a tough,
it scares me like it scared,
sure.
like it scared Hamilton. If you have a judiciary in the tank with one of the other branches, it's enormous.
I mean, here's the thing: is that this is not a hypothetical. We have, if you look at the rulings of this current Roberts court, they're overwhelmingly for concentrating power either with Wall Street and giant corporations, with the executive branch and Trump himself, or with the Republican Party. This is a court that is achieving the monopoly of power they are protecting power for the most powerful, and that's it.
Yep. Well, and we saw that in full display on those leaked memos at the dawn of the
absolutely
docket, where they said our credibility is at stake because we can't protect the oil company from being regulated. And they didn't say our credibility is at stake about the law. Oh my God, we might not be able to protect the oil companies from being regulated.
And by the way, even with the tariff decision, where they said, well, and frankly, Trump was humiliated by that decision because it was one of his signature. It was like it was the embodiment of I'm a deal making president, and so that's my economic. The tariffs were how he made deals. That was inherent to him.
He's a mob president, and they were his.
That's right. Sure, exactly.
They were his leverage,
of course. Yeah. But what I think was interesting is that I think people misread when the Supreme Court ruled. They misread the intention of the court. I don't think the court was ruling there against Trump. I think they were ruling in favor of the giant corporations who were going to be hurt by the tariffs. In that case, it wasn't that they didn't rule in favor of the powerful party. They actually ruled in favor of the other powerful party.
Right. Yeah. So I until recently, I thought, look, I'm sympathetic to the court because really important decisions that need to be made, Congress won't make. and they have to be made, and it falls on somebody to make them. Congress is broken. Now, leaving aside that John Roberts, that they broke Congress with Citizens United. Right, they broke it. So that's on them to begin with. But now I no longer believe that. Because when Congress has acted, as in McCain-Feingold, as in the Voting Rights Act, for God's sake, Congress did its job, and these people undid it. So I no longer, I gave them a lot of sway for saying, look, but we have an Article 1 problem, and that's what's messed up all of this and forced the judiciary to deal with questions they really shouldn't have to grapple with, but somebody must. Now I don't believe it. I believe that if Congress passed a law today that was clear about gerrymandering, that you can't do it, they would overturn it. They would just say, yeah, no. They are exercising imperial authority behind those robes in a way that is dangerous to a democracy.
Right. I think that's right. And in the case of McCain-Feingold, which was about regulating self-money, essentially the court re-argued it and said, well, we're going to make this about, they expanded the scope of the question. Normally the Supreme Court is supposed to minimize, in theory, make shrink the question that it's supposed to decide to the smallest one possible. Right, because the power to legislate should be with Congress.
Somebody else. Yeah.
But in the case of Citizens United, they actually expanded the question to achieve a result. So I think that's right. I think that but now I think we have an Article 1 challenge, because I think what we have is not just a far right court, but we they've essentially taken. The Roberts Court has essentially asserted judicial supremacy in these matters, and I think you're right. You think about the next Democratic president, and if they pass a progressive, a slate of policies, it's going to run into the buzzsaw of this Roberts Court. And so it's going to be up, I think it's fair to say that any Democratic candidate for president in 2028, if they don't have as part of their policy platform a strategy to deal with the Roberts Court and the buzzsaw it exists now, then you can't take any of the other proposals seriously, because they're just going to go there to die.
They're going to, right? We had this problem in the 1760s, leading up to our revolution, when colonial congresses, legislators passed laws and the local governors annulled them.
Yep.
Right? It led to a revolution. Yep. And there is in this little document here, again, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but there is an exceptions clause that can be used to limit what this court gets to rule on. And I think the Article 1 powers should assert themselves with some aggression here to limit this court.
I agree. And this is why I think, Demand Justice, our organization, has long been in favor of Supreme Court expansion, in part because it's facially constitutional. The Supreme Court hasn't always had 9 justices. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, famously threatened to expand the court in, what they teach us in law school is called the switch in time that saved 9, right? Where he basically threatened to pack the Supreme Court and expand it if the court didn't essentially stop, overturning all of his policy.
And they did.
And they did, and I think I have a concern about the people calling for term limits for the Supreme Court, because I think that any policy to address the problems with the Supreme Court that gives them a way to strike it down, to me is not going to do it, and is not a serious proposal. And I agree with you on the Congress's assertion. I mean, I think there are serious conversations right now about Congress passing laws to limit the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court and other federal courts, because I think, again, it wasn't always the case, but I think this Supreme Court, this Roberts Court, has done everything they can to concentrate power with the powerful. And until we do something to break that up, it's just going to keep going. And frankly, I think it is in the court and our country's best interest, because I think that honestly, to me, expanding the Supreme Court and limiting its jurisdiction now is gonna in the long term would wind up being less radical than what would come if we don't do something now. To your point about our previous revolution, it would be less radical to expand the court now than to continue on this path and see what happens and see how the people rise up.
Yeah, I mean. it's been known by people who think about government forever that a partisan judiciary is a danger to any idea of freedom and democracy, and this is what we've got. It, in ways that are really anti-democratic across the board, what they've unleashed across America now in terms of racial gerrymandering.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm in my late 60s. Most of my life was like America becoming a real democracy.
Yeah.
I mean, Black Americans couldn't vote freely in presidential elections. The first one was 1968.
That's right.
And now across the South.
And I think that there's an argument that, we've really only been a fully realized democracy, to your point, for a much, Trump is going to, go headlong into this 250th anniversary of the country. Look, I would argue that we have not been a full democracy. I think it's a pretty simple case to make that we have not been a fully functioning, inclusive democracy for 250 years. I mean, it's impossible to say that we haven't, right?
It's an idea that's been unfolding.
It's been an idea, correct,
and a struggle to achieve it, and now it's in a struggle to keep it.
And I think about after the Dobbs decision, which overturned, Roe v. Wade and its, generations of precedent. Something that at the time then Vice President Harris said, which is that we're gonna, our kids now are going to be the first generation that is going to grow up with fewer rights than we did. And that was true when they overturned Dobbs. It's made more true now that they've, with this Calais decision, essentially gutting the last bastions of the Voting Rights Act. And I think, to go back to this, and I think that why it's so important to talk about this so plainly, and frankly in political terms, is because even you saw with the Calais decision that gutted the rest of the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, rather. They tried to, the conservative majority in the court tried to argue, well, we didn't dismantle the Voting Rights Act. It's still there.
We just
did, right. And
it's a lie.
Right. But that's the essence of the Roberts problem, is that they're lying to our faces about what they're doing, and then they're complaining when we notice. And I think that part of the challenge we face in reforms for our democracy, both after Trump in the executive branch and in the Supreme Court, is how do we get to a place where we have branches of government, and I think this is true with the Supreme Court, certainly, that even if we have people with ideology in one way or another, whether it's, let's say it's not partisan, it's going to be ideology. People just have different ideologies. That's part of the nature and the function of our democracy. It has to be transparently honest about who that ideology serves. And what I think has happened, and why the Supreme Court has, the nature of its secrecy, the nature of its sort of elite nature, has been that they've created this myth, this long-standing sort of story of a lie about how they've been calling balls and strikes, when the whole time they've been following an ideology of concentrated power. And I think people now understand that, and they're really mad. They're really mad about that. They're really mad about how that it's going to play out in congressional elections. But I think people look. I don't think this is going to become violent, and I would never say it should be. But I think what I think that the big mistake and what is going to be Roberts' legacy here is that when this problem of people's lack of faith in the Supreme Court and their belief in its partisan and political nature sort of reached this, maybe it's an apex, maybe they haven't reached the apex yet, reached the point that it is now, did he try and find ways to in a way that was not condescending, the way that was respectful to people and their views of democracy and how informed they are about what their government does, did he find a way to adjust, to change course? Did he basically double down on the myth? And right now he's doubling down on the myth. And that's not going to change until we change the structure of the court.
Yeah. Let me ask a question that is impossible for a lawyer to answer, and I apologize. But what if the next president showed up and said, the Supreme Court's illegitimate, and there are a pack of rulings that they have that are illegitimate, and they have to do with power in America. I am going to enforce the Voting Rights Act as it existed, period. We are going to, and my majority in Congress will not seat anyone elected from an illegal district. And I don't care what those robed oracles have to say about it. Because that's the logical, terrible outcome of what you have told me. This court is illegitimate. It is it is breaking our idea of law for a partisan purpose, and we have other branches of government that could behave the same way.
So
it's enormously dangerous, but I think we are very close to that.
So I think it's going to be incumbent on the next president, on a leader, to distinguish between the illegitimacy of the Supreme Court as a branch of government, as a constitutional branch of our government, and the Supreme Court as a currently sitting far-right majority. And so,
That's question, a very small needle of thread.
Well, that's the nature. That's the nature of our progress. I mean, because I think that what you're saying is calling the question of a constitutional crisis.
Well, we're in one.
I think we're in one.
I think they caused it.
I agree. But I think the question is, as we know in our democracy, it is only true if we're able to communicate it well. And I think the danger, I think, with that, and it's something that I think we'd have to think about more specifically. I think doing that on a global, doing this across 5 different decisions, saying none of these were legit, and so I'm going to pretend they never happened. I think doing that doing that with such breadth, I think, would be a hard sell, because it would look like the president was actually questioning the credibility of the Supreme Court as an institution. Now, if a new president was proposing some fairly radical reforms to the Supreme Court, including expansion, that at the same time sort of inherently acknowledges the credibility of the court itself, but that it just needs to be restored, right? That the fundamental concept of the court is legit. And then perhaps, and I have to think through the likelihood of that, I'm just sort of thinking both as a lawyer and a political operative, and then perhaps chose one decision that was so egregiously illegitimate and then selectively did not follow. That would, I can see that as a more saleable case. That we're now just playing parlor games here, but I do think that
moving this so-called Overton window.
Well, right, but I do think fundamentally, looking at what a next Democratic president is going to have to face, it is like they're going to have to propose things that will actually train. This is no longer just about the switch in time that saved 9, because where Roosevelt felt that he could actually affect the conduct of the court with a threat. Mm-hmm. I think we're past that. I just don't. I think that a president is actually, and a Congress is actually going to have to change the dynamic of a court. And by the way, I would be fairly excited to vote for, if to vote in a presidential election, if I thought it meant that President Ocasio-Cortez was going to be able to appoint, 6 new justices. But I think that in the short term, though, we have a even more acute problem, which is that I believe that Donald Trump is going to get 2 Supreme Court vacancies this year, because I think the apex of his power to nominate and confirm them is between now and the midterm. And we're doing this now at a time where not a single one of his judicial nominees to lifetime seats at any level of the federal court will even admit he lost the 2020 election or that January 6th was an attack on the Capitol. I mean, we've got a real problem. And by the way, 19 Senate Democrats have voted for at least one of these judges.
I can't get over it. I can't. I have nothing good to say about the old habit that old members of my party are in of let's make a deal. You cannot make a good deal with a bad partner. And this is where we are.
That's right.
They can't do it. And so they have, I mean, you see the damage that someone like Eileen Cannon has done. Why would you want to repeat that?
Well, and you think through too, like, I can see, I can sort of think if I sort of force myself to, I can sort of think like one of these senators and saying, well, hedging on the 2020 election and saying, well, technically, giving one of these evasive, weird answers, they'll all say that, well, technically Joe Biden was certified the winner. It's like they can't actually say that he was a winner. Yeah.
Josh, I got to interrupt you because we are almost out of time.
Okay.
So let's use the minute we have left for you to tell people how to follow your work to make a difference.
Yeah, you can follow us online at We Demand Justice and go to our website, demandjustice.org. Look, what we're doing right now is we're preparing for 1 or 2 Supreme Court vacancies this calendar year before the midterm from Donald Trump. We have to be ready. We have to be ready to fight back. And we have to be ready to hold Democrats accountable if they're unwilling to fight these nominations. It is essential. Trump is attacking our democracy, and we have to be ready to fight.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Me too. Thanks. Let's do it again.